The glass hit the marble floor of the 14th floor corridor a half-second before Dara Finch did. No one moved immediately. In the Shea Group's accounting department, stillness had a way of spreading, the same way silence spreads in a room where something has gone very wrong and nobody wants to be the first to name it. Then Paxton, Eamon Shea's personal assistant, bolted from the adjacent corridor. "Call an ambulance." His voice was careful, controlled. He dropped beside her. Her breathing was shallow, barely there, her color the kind of gray that doesn't happen from ordinary tiredness. Someone was already dialing. Someone else began checking her pulse. Paxton was deciding between waiting for security and trying to lift her himself when the door at the end of the hall opened. Nobody had to look to know who it was. Every conversation in a 30-meter radius stopped on its own. Eamon Shea walked past the cluster of frozen employees without a word. He was still in the charcoal suit he'd worn to the morning board presentation, the one that had taken his team 3 months to prepare. He crouched beside her, looked at her face, and then stood. "I'll take her." Paxton moved instinctively. "Mr. Shea, security can." "I said I'll take her, not louder, just final." He lifted her as though she weighed nothing he hadn't already decided to carry. The elevator to the underground parking opened immediately. It always opened immediately for Eamon Shea. The black SUV was running before the lobby doors had even closed behind him. Dara Finch, 29 years old, senior bookkeeper, had worked 67 hours in the past 5 days. Nobody in that building had known. Nobody had been paying that kind of attention. Eamon Shea had been paying the wrong kind. The kind that noticed productivity numbers and invoice, turnaround times and error rates, all of which had been perfect, as always, under her. He had not been paying attention to the human being behind the numbers. That would change. The attending physician at Toronto General's private wing was a calm woman named Dr. Okonkwo, who had dealt with powerful men standing in her hospital corridor before. She did not lower her voice when she gave the update, which Eamon respected. "She's severely dehydrated. Blood pressure is dangerously low. She'll need at least 48 hours on fluids, and she needs real rest before returning to any kind of work." Eamon looked at her steadily. "Will there be lasting effects?" Dr. Okonkwo chose her next words with the particular care of someone who had learned that certain men heard only the parts that mattered to them. "Not if she rests now." "But Mr. Shea," she paused. "The blood work suggests this isn't an isolated incident. Her body has been running on empty for some time, weeks, possibly longer." He said nothing. She watched him process that. "Another few days," she added quietly, "and we might be having a very different conversation." Eamon remained outside Dara's room for a long time after Dr. Okonkwo left. He had stood in rooms where men were dying and felt nothing except the clinical calculation of what their deaths would cost him. He had negotiated outcomes that ended lives and signed off on decisions that kept him awake 0 minutes afterward. This was different. This was the particular discomfort of realizing that something had been happening right in front of him, and he had missed it entirely because he hadn't thought to look. He called Paxton. "Clear everything for the rest of the week." A pause. "Including the Vancouver call?" "Everything. The investment briefing with the Moreau Group is..." "Paxton." "Cleared. Yes, sir. And I want Dara Finch's personnel file, her time-tracking records, and every overtime log going back 12 months on my desk by morning." He hung up before Paxton could ask why. He already knew he wouldn't like what he found, but he needed to see it anyway. Dara's file arrived before sunrise. Eamon read it in the room adjacent to hers, the one the hospital's private wing kept for families. He wasn't family. Nobody had challenged that. The time-tracking logs were straightforward once you knew what to look for. She had been covering for Tobias Grant, a colleague on extended medical leave, for 11 weeks. Not partially. Fully, every deadline Tobias would have held, Dara had absorbed without a single complaint logged, a single request for accommodation, or a single note to her supervisor. Her supervisor was a woman named Carla Wren, who ran the administrative operations side of the Shea Group's legitimate holdings with the kind of hyper-organized efficiency that hid a systematic blindness to anything that didn't affect her own performance metrics. Carla Wren's file was much thinner than Dara Finch's. Her outputs were high. Her employee welfare record was almost entirely blank. Amon kept reading. He found the payroll deductions next. Every week, a significant percentage of Dara's salary transferred to a clinic in Scarborough. He cross-referenced the billing address. Physiotherapy Center, specialized rehabilitation, spinal and mobility recovery. He made a note. Paxton appeared in the doorway just after 7 in the morning, which meant he had driven downtown before the subway was running. He waited until Amon acknowledged him. "I pulled the records you asked for. There's also," Paxton hesitated, "there's a note on file. Maintenance flagged it 8 months ago. Small item." Amon looked up. "Someone had been leaving a covered thermos and a printed weather summary outside your office every Tuesday morning since last January. Facilities thought it was a delivery error for the first 3 weeks. They eventually traced it." Paxton cleared his throat. It was Miss Finch. The room was very quiet. "She printed the weather," Amon said. "And the UV index, and the time the sun set, apparently." Paxton glanced at his notes. There was always a handwritten note. Facilities kept a few. He set a small plastic sleeve on the table. 3 folded slips of white paper inside, the kind torn from a notepad. Amon opened the first one. "The forecast says freezing rain this afternoon. If you're walking to the King Street site, take the covered path through the building. DF." The second, Tuesday again. "The thermos is French press this time. You left your last one in the conference room and someone else claimed it. This one has your name on the bottom. DF. The third, shorter than the others. You cancelled the Friday lunch with the hospital board again. I rescheduled it for March. You should probably eat something today that isn't from the vending machine. There are almonds in the left drawer of the credenza. I put them there in November in case you ever looked. You haven't. DF. He read that last one twice. Paxton waited. Did I ever acknowledge them? Eamon asked. Paxton thought about it carefully. No, sir, but facilities mentioned that the drawer of the credenza was consistently empty on Wednesdays. So, there was a long silence. It was Eamon who eventually broke it, his voice quieter than his assistant had heard in years. What's the clinic in Scarborough? Paxton already had the answer. Her sister, Piper Finch, 22 years old. She was hit by a drunk driver 14 months ago. Spinal contusion. She's been in rehabilitation since. The prognosis is good, but the private clinic is significantly faster than the public waitlist. He paused. Miss Finch has been covering the gap between what OHIP provides and what the private clinic charges. By herself. There's no one else. Their parents passed several years ago. Eamon set the notes down on the table. She had spent 14 months quietly drawing down her own reserves, so her sister could walk again. She had covered Tobias Grant's workload on top of her own. Without asking for recognition or additional pay, she had left French press coffee and handwritten notes outside the office of a man who ran one of the most dangerous criminal enterprises in Ontario. Because someone had decided that someone ought to remind him to eat almonds and check the weather. And he had never once asked how she was. He stood. Get me a full review of Carla Wren's management practices going back 2 years. His voice was steady. Every decision she made about staffing, workload, leave coverage. Everything. Paxton nodded. And one more thing. Eamon looked at him directly. I want to know why the most capable person in that accounting department believed burning out was easier than asking for support. He didn't wait for an answer. There wasn't one yet that would satisfy him. Dara woke to the sound of a machine she didn't recognize, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and fresh flowers she couldn't see. Everything was heavy, her arms, her eyelids, even the effort of understanding where she was required, more than she could easily give. The last thing she remembered was the corridor on the 14th floor, the report she'd been carrying, the feeling that the lights had been growing very bright and then very far away. She reached out without fully meaning to, some instinct searching for something solid, something that would stay still while the room reorganized itself around her. Her fingers found warmth. She held on. The warmth didn't move away. When her eyes finally focused, she turned her head. Eamon Shea was sitting beside her bed, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't alarm. It wasn't the controlled assessment she usually saw from him in meetings. It was something quieter and considerably harder to look at directly. She also became aware, approximately 1 second later, that she was holding his hand. The heat that rose to her face had nothing to do with fever. She let go immediately, pulling her hand back beneath the blanket. "I'm so sorry, I didn't realize." "Dara," his voice was low, "stop." She stopped. He leaned forward slightly. "The first thing you did when you woke up was apologize." He let that sit for a moment. "You haven't asked where you are, or what happened, or how long you've been here. You apologized." She opened her mouth. "That tells me something I needed to know," he said. The room felt very small suddenly. She looked down at the blanket. "I caused disruption. I know the Moreau briefing was this week. If my absence..." It didn't matter. The Tobias files still need. Someone else has them. The quarterly close is in 11 days. And if no one starts the reconciliation... "Dara," he said it the same way the second time. Not sharp, just certain. "The reconciliation will happen. What won't happen if you don't slow down is you walking out of this hospital on your own." She went quiet, not because she agreed, because something in his voice made disagreeing feel suddenly beside the point. "I was managing fine," she said. "It came out smaller than she'd intended." "You were managing everything," he said. "That's not the same thing." A nurse appeared at the door, checked the monitor, made a note, and left without interrupting them. Dara watched the door close. "How long have I been here?" "Almost a full day." She closed her eyes briefly. A full day. She calculated rapidly. Piper's Thursday appointment at the clinic, the carpool arrangement she'd made with the physio coordinator, the meal she'd left in her sister's fridge because Piper still couldn't stand at the stove for long. She felt her throat tighten. "My sister," Paxton called the clinic. His voice gentled in a way she hadn't known it could. "She's been told you're resting. She's not worried. She sends her love." The tightening got worse, not better. Dara pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in front of Eamon Shea. She was not going to be that person. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "You wouldn't have." She looked at him directly for the first time since waking. It was the longest she had ever looked at him without a meeting agenda between them. He was 42. She knew that from his file. She knew everyone's file, because that was her job. And he looked like someone who had been making hard decisions for so long, that the weight of them had simply become his resting posture. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that weren't from smiling. His jaw was set in the particular way she'd noticed it got when something was going to be dealt with, whether it wanted to be or not. "You should go," she said. "You've already lost too much time." "No," he said. "Simple as that, I haven't." The Shea Group's annual foundation gala fell 3 weeks after Dara was discharged from hospital. By then, everyone in the organization knew something had shifted. Not dramatically. Eamon Shea rarely did things dramatically, but in the quiet, specific way that things shift when someone at the top has decided to pay attention to something he previously overlooked. Dara's schedule had been restructured. Tobias's coverage was formally redistributed across 3 people instead of quietly settled on 1. New protocols were circulating from HR about leave coverage and overtime caps. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone understood that the 48 hours Dara had spent unconscious in a hospital room had somehow become the reason the entire administrative infrastructure of the Shea Group was being quietly rebuilt. Dara herself had tried to argue about the schedule changes. Twice. Both times, Eamon had listened to her full case and then told her the decision was made. The third time, she had looked at him across his desk and said, with the mild exasperation of someone who had run out of professional angles, "You are the most stubborn man I have ever worked for." He had looked back at her and said, without blinking, "I've been told." She had left the office, trying not to smile, and mostly failing. She almost didn't attend the gala. Olivia Shea, Eamon's mother, who served on the foundation's board and had a quiet opinion about everything, had called her personally. "You've spent 3 years making sure everyone else had what they needed," Olivia had said, with the particular warmth of a woman who had learned to cut straight to it. "Come and let someone take care of that for one evening." She went. She wore a deep green dress that fit her well, and that she'd chosen because she liked it, and was finished caring whether anyone else agreed. She arrived early enough to help the events team with a last-minute seating issue, because old habits are honest, and left them to it once it was sorted. Carla Wren found her near the drink station 40 minutes into the evening. Carla was polished and precise, and had a smile that operated entirely independently from her eyes. She had been formally placed on administrative review following Eamon's investigation, but the process was ongoing, and until it concluded, she remained technically employed. "Dara," she said it warmly, "you look well, all things considered." Dara smiled. "Carla, enjoying the evening?" "Very much." Carla tilted her head slightly. "I have to say, it's remarkable how much has changed since your little episode." Several nearby guests slowed without quite turning around. Dara kept her voice even. "People do tend to take workplace health seriously when someone collapses." "Of course." Carla smiled wider. "I just wonder sometimes whether the timing was quite as unplanned as it appeared. You've always been very clever with numbers." She paused, letting the implication settle like something dropped into still water. "And the results for you personally have been quite significant, haven't they? New protocols, Mr. Sh's personal involvement." She glanced around at the room. It almost makes you wonder what a person might do for that kind of attention." The guests who had slowed were no longer pretending to be doing anything else. Dara felt the familiar pull, the one she'd spent years obeying, the one that said, "Lower your eyes, make yourself smaller, don't make this worse." She had gotten very good at that pull. It had protected her from a great many things. It had also cost her a great many things she couldn't get back. Her ex-boyfriend had told her, when he left 2 years ago, that she was easiest to love at a distance. Too much of everything, too careful, too present, too determined to fill every gap she found. He'd said it like it was a compliment he'd decided not to give her. She had believed him for much longer than she should have. She looked at Carla Wren directly. "I worked 67 hours in 5 days," she said, "on top of 11 weeks of a colleague's full workload. I don't know what you think I was calculating in the middle of that, but I promise it wasn't this." Carla's smile thinned. "And I'll tell you the other thing." Dara kept her voice entirely level. "Kindness isn't a strategy. It's just something some people do because they think other people matter. The fact that someone eventually noticed doesn't make it a performance. A hand settled on Carla Wren's elbow. A woman in a burgundy suit, Olivia Shea, who had apparently been close enough to hear everything and had been moving toward them since approximately the moment Carla said little episode, appeared at her side. "Carla." Olivia's voice was pleasant the way marble is pleasant, smooth and offering no purchase. "I believe the board liaison was looking for you earlier." "Something about the review documentation." She smiled. "You wouldn't want to be unavailable." Carla left. Dara released a breath she had been holding longer than she'd realized. Olivia stayed beside her for a moment, without speaking. "You did that well," Olivia said quietly. "You moved her along." "I just provided the exit." Olivia glanced toward the far side of the room. "He's been watching since the moment she approached you." Dara didn't look. She could feel it anyway. The particular quality of attention that Eamon Shea brought to things he had decided mattered. "He worries," Olivia said simply, as though that explained something much larger. Then she moved to greet someone else. Eamon arrived at Dara's side a few minutes later. He didn't speak immediately. They stood together near the edge of the room, looking out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the lights of Toronto scattered below the way lights scatter when a city is doing its quiet, complicated, ongoing thing. "You heard all of it," she said. "Enough." She looked at her glass. "You didn't need to intervene. I handled it." "You did." A pause. "I stayed where I was because I could see you had it. But if you hadn't," he let the sentence end itself. She looked at him sideways. "Mr. Shea, did you just admit that you were ready to rescue me, and then didn't because I didn't need rescuing?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was the closest she'd seen him come to a smile in 3 years of working for him. "Possibly." She felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the venue's heating. Carla Wren's employment with the Shea Group ended the following Monday morning. The formal review documented what Eamon already knew: systematic reassignment of work to the most accommodating people, never the most available, and a deliberate preference for quiet cooperation over accurate reporting of staff capacity. It was not criminal. It was common. It was exactly the kind of thing that wore good people down so slowly nobody noticed until one of them stopped moving entirely. The restructuring that followed was comprehensive in the specific way that things become comprehensive when they're driven by guilt and anger in roughly equal measure. The Shea Group's new employee welfare framework covered mandatory coverage protocols, a confidential staff support line, paid caregiver leave, transparent overtime allocation, and quarterly capacity reviews for every department. Eamon personally reviewed every policy draft. Everyone came back with handwritten margin notes. "This cap is still too high. People won't say anything. Set it lower." Who decides what counts as adequate rest time? Make the standard explicit. Don't leave it to individual managers. What happens if an employee reports overwork and nothing changes? There needs to be an escalation path added. The board members who reviewed the final package privately admitted they had never seen Eamon Shea engage with human resources policy at this level of specificity. What they didn't say aloud, but understood clearly, was that none of it had begun in a boardroom. Dara returned to work 6 weeks after her collapse. Her new role was Director of Internal Operations and Staff Welfare for the Shea Group, a title that made her stand very still in Eamon's office for several seconds when he told her. "I'm a bookkeeper," she said. "You were a bookkeeper," he said. "You also caught an embezzlement issue in the Aldgate account 3 months ago that saved this company $400,000 and asked for nothing in return. You rebuilt the entire accounts reconciliation system last spring because the old methodology had a flaw that no one else found. You covered another person's full workload for 3 months without a single error. And you apparently understand how this organization actually functions better than anyone who's been paid to know it. She looked at the offer letter on his desk. I'm not sure I'm qualified. Dara. He waited until she looked at him. No one in this building is more qualified to recognize what exhaustion looks like before it becomes a crisis. Because you've lived it. His voice dropped slightly. I should have noticed before you collapsed. That's on me. But going forward, this work needs someone who understands it from the inside. She picked up the letter. She read it twice. She set it back down and looked at him for a long moment. The particular kind of looking that means I'm trying to decide whether to say the thing I actually mean. You kept the almonds in the credenza, she said finally. He didn't quite follow her. Then, the ones you put there in November. You knew it was me. Not until last month, a pause, but yes, I knew. She nodded slowly. Did the weather reports help? Twice. The freezing rain would have made me late to meetings I couldn't reschedule. He said it without inflection, but she'd been reading his particular kind of neutrality for 3 years. That's one way to say thank you, she said. I'm not good at thank you. I'm aware of that. I know, she said simply. I left the notes anyway. The room was very quiet. Outside, Toronto moved and hummed the way it does in late October, all hurried footsteps and the smell of lake wind and coffee from the cafe on the corner that Dara passed every morning and occasionally thought about stopping at on the days she had the time, which were not as many days as she'd have liked. Dara. He said her name the way he'd been saying it since the hospital, not like an employee, not like a subordinate, like something he was choosing to be careful with. She waited. I've spent a very long time, he said, in rooms where people told me exactly what they thought I wanted to hear. Every advisor, every associate, every person who stood across from me with something they needed. He paused, working out how to say the next part. You left me notes about the weather. You put almonds in a drawer and didn't mention it. You brought me a $400,000 catch and asked for nothing, except that someone should probably look at the Aldgate account. His voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. You treated me like a person who needed to eat lunch and check the forecast. She looked at him. I didn't know, he said quietly, how much I needed someone to do that, until you stopped. There were several things she might have said. She was aware of all of them, and aware that most of them were deflections, the kind she'd been building her whole life out of the material of too much, too present, too big for whatever room you're standing in. Her ex had told her she was easiest to love at a distance. She had believed him for longer than she should have. She thought about the distance between her chair and Eamon Shea's desk. She thought about Piper doing her exercises in the living room of their shared apartment. The way she'd looked last Sunday morning, actually laughing at something on television, weight on both feet for the first time in over a year. She thought about what it meant to stop making herself smaller on purpose. I didn't leave those notes because I expected anything from you, she said. I did it because you seemed like a person who forgot he was a person. A breath, and I thought someone should remind you. He looked at her for a long time. Someone should have reminded me sooner, he said. She felt the air in the room shift the way it shifts sometimes, when something is about to become true that wasn't quite true a moment before. She reached across the desk and picked up the offer letter. She signed it. The Shea Foundation's year-end report, 3 months later, drew more journalists than the previous 2 years combined. Not for the financial figures, which were strong, but for a segment near the end of the evening where 4 Shea Group employees spoke about what had changed for them in the past quarter. A logistics coordinator described attending his son's winter concert for the first time in 4 years. An accounts manager described using the new caregiver leave when her mother had a stroke, and not once being made to feel that her absence was a problem. A security supervisor described the counseling service. He had used it, and said it had helped him in the specific way that things help when they arrive before you've given up on them. A young woman from payroll said, simply, that she had put in a leave request last month, and no one had made her feel guilty about it. That she had expected to feel guilty anyway, because she always did. That she hadn't. That she wasn't sure yet what to do with that, but it felt like a beginning. Dara sat in the front row and let herself cry without trying to stop. When the floor opened for questions, a reporter near the back raised a hand. "Miss Finch." The microphone swung toward her. "You moved from a bookkeeping role to leading this entire welfare initiative in a matter of months. What do you think makes someone equipped for that kind of work?" She thought about the question for a moment. "Understanding what people don't say," she answered. "What they don't ask for. What they keep doing quietly, alone, because they've decided their limits are their own problem." She paused. "I wasn't very good at asking for help. I got very good at noticing when other people weren't asking. I don't think that's a qualification exactly. But it's the only honest answer I have." There was a pause, and then applause. Not the polite kind, but the kind that happens when a room full of people recognize something real. Eamon was at the podium for the closing remarks. Dara watched him cross the stage afterward, moving through the room the way he always moved. People instinctively clearing space, not from fear exactly, but from the particular gravity of someone who has never once had to ask twice for something he's decided to pursue. He walked directly to where she was standing. She looked up at him. "That was the right answer," he said. "I didn't know it until I said it. That's how the right ones work." She laughed quietly. He was watching her the way he'd been watching her for 3 months. Steadily, fully, like someone who had spent a very long time looking at numbers and had recently discovered that the most important things don't resolve to a figure. She slipped her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers without hesitation. No announcement, no explanation. Just the simple fact of 2 people standing in a lit room in the city that had asked more of both of them than either had ever planned to give. Later, on the drive back, the Toronto skyline moving past the window in the particular way it does in early winter, all cold glass and amber light, and the faint glow above the gardener. Dara rested her head against Eamon's shoulder. "I used to think," she said, "that if I just kept covering everything, kept being useful, kept not asking, no one would have a reason to notice I was there." A pause. "I thought invisible was safe." His hand tightened around hers. "I see you," he said. It was very quiet, meant only for her. I should have said so much earlier. She closed her eyes. Outside, the city kept moving the way cities do, carrying everyone inside it, without asking whether the weight is too much, trusting that somewhere along the way, someone has finally learned to share it.